Hello class, hope things are going well. This is part 2 of our Act 5 Scene 1 from Jerusalem to Rome lecture. And we spent quite a bit of time in part 1 introducing the book of Acts and the whole process of the outlining of witnesses in Jerusalem, witnesses in Judea and Samaria, and then witnesses to the ends of the earth. So I will refer you to that part 1 video to catch on that. Let's jump right in to Acts chapters 8 through 12, witnesses in Judea and Samaria. So Jerusalem is a city which is located in the province of Judea, and the province just to the north of Judea is Samaria. And so Acts 8 through 12 talks about how the gospel is going to spread from Jerusalem throughout the province of Jerusalem, Judea, and on into the neighboring province of Samaria. Now the conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans is well rehearsed, and you can find lots of details about that. A few references in the biblical text. I don't want to exaggerate that too much because Jesus ministered in and around Samaria, worked with Samaritans, and saw them as created in the image of God, just as he did all of the Israelis and everybody else for that matter. And just as we did with the witnesses in Jerusalem, I want to start with a summary statement for witnesses in Judea and Samaria. And it picks up here. Following the martyrdom of Stephen, the church begins to bear witness in the neighboring areas of Judea and Samaria, demonstrating how the gospel will spread to the Gentiles. Now, since Jesus is seen as, since Jesus is Jewish, and he's seen as the fulfillment of the promise of God to send a Messiah to bring about deliverance for them, to work on that process of restoration and redemption that we've been talking about in that larger narrative of the grand drama of the Bible. You'll notice several sections of that back here on page 5 that are outlined since we began with Act 3 have all centered on that idea of restoration. Hope you are reading your book and following along. And we saw in Act 3, it was described, the subtitle for Act 3 was Restoration Initiated. For Act 4, Restoration Accomplished. And now in Act 5, we see the mission of the church is the subtitle, but the mission of the church is to be a part of that a restoration accomplished. Then when we get to Act 6, in the next section, this will talk about restoration completed. And we see that in our summary section, that he's working to spread the gospel. The first big thing is to kind of begin to restore some of these natural divisions, racial divisions between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not the Palestinians, that's today, but same issue between them and the Samaritans. And what we really learn is that salvation didn't just come for the Jews, but salvation came for the whole world, even the Gentiles, Jew and Gentile. This is one of the big themes that we see in Acts 8 through 12, is struggling with, can Gentiles become believers? And if they can, how do they do that? Do they have to convert to Judaism first, or do they just go and accept Christ by faith alone? We see that ultimately is the solution. And what we see in the witnesses in Judea and Samaria, Acts 8 through 12, what we see here is a series of people, all of whom we've met before in the narrative, who play a role in the spread of the gospel to the Gentiles. First big character we might talk about would be Philip. Now, Philip is one of the 7 who was chosen back in Acts 6 to be one of those servanthood leaders. And Philip is really important in this section because he kind of bridges the ministry from Stephen's martyrdom to Judea and Samaria. And Philip goes and he evangelizes amongst the Samaritans. He's a little surprised, to be honest, that they respond, but it's confirmed through not only the apostles, but also by what we call the Samaritan Pentecost, which was an event much like Pentecost in Acts chapter 8, where the Holy Spirit fell upon them. And Philip is really recognized as the first person to preach the gospel outside of Jerusalem. Boy, that would make a really good multiple choice question. Who was the first person to preach the gospel outside of Jerusalem based on Acts? Well, Philip is the right answer. The Apostle John comes along beside him, confirms the work, and we see Philip doing that. We also see another story or two about Philip. One of the notable ones is in Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. And here he preaches and shares the gospel with a guy who's just known as the Ethiopian eunuch. So we have somebody who is from another continent. We have somebody who is from a different race. We have somebody who is completely different than Jews. Now, the Ethiopian eunuch seems to have been a God-fearer. He's been to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh, but he's still kind of seen by the Jews as an outsider. But he doesn't have to do anything to convert to Christianity except accept Christ by faith, and he follows him in water baptism. And so we see Philip playing a role in bridging that gap. Now, another person that we meet in this section, and who plays an important role, is Peter. This is the Apostle Peter from the Gospels. We saw him back in Acts chapter 2 preaching his sermon. Now he is also evangelizing in the area of Samaria. First in a town along the coast by the name of Joppa. And then he's called from Joppa to go to Caesarea Maritima, a very Roman-style town filled with Gentiles and many Romans. In fact, he's called to the house of a man by the name of Cornelius. And when I say called, I mean he's given a vision by the Lord that he needs to go. And Cornelius is given a vision that he needs to send people down to get Peter. And Peter goes with them and he preaches to Cornelius and all of his household. And not only does Cornelius, but so does all of his household. They become followers, and they all follow in water baptism. And again, there's no expectations that they need to convert to Judaism, that they're not starting to keep the Sabbath or the kosher laws. None of that is brought up at all. In fact, we see Peter in chapter 10 have a prayer time with the Lord, where the Lord basically tells him, kosher rules are non-existent now. I'm removing them. And you can eat from all of the animals of the earth because they are part of my creation. Then probably the most important person that we meet in Acts 8 through 12. And in fact, Goheen and Bartholomew in our book talk a little bit about the Apostle Paul. Of course, we meet him as a man named Saul. He's Jewish. He's grown up in Judaism. He's a trained rabbi from one of the finest rabbinic schools in Jerusalem, and had probably the best known and best rabbinic teacher in Jerusalem at the time, a man by the name of Gamaliel, as his teacher. So his academics, his Jewish academics, are beyond compare. And he's very much against Christianity as it first comes about. I mentioned in part 1, Saul was actually involved in the stoning of Stephen. And in fact, we see Saul first, and this is the first scene that we see him in Acts chapter 8, Acts 8, 1 through 3. You can pick up and read about him in chapter 7, verse 58, and it goes on into verses 1 through 3 of chapter 8. And we see that not only was Paul or Saul, I'm going to just call him Paul. He goes by Saul, and then on the first missionary journey, he begins to go by Paul, and he remains known as Paul from that point forward. So if you see Saul written here early on, it just hasn't made that transition yet. But not only was he present at the persecution of Stephen, but he was inspired by the persecution and killing of Stephen, because we see in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, that he goes to the leaders in Jerusalem, and he basically gets papers, arrest warrants, with blanks for names. That I'm describing that figuratively, not exactly. But he gets permission to pursue Christians who have fled Jerusalem and arrest both men and women, male and female Christians. That's one of Luke's emphases in his books of Luke and Acts, is the important role that women played in not only in the ministry of Jesus, but in the history of the early church. And we see that because he could arrest women as well, that kind of emphasizes their role. He can chase them. He can pursue them as far as Damascus and drag them back to Jerusalem for punishment. So Paul was definitely inspired by the death of Stephen. And that's the first picture that we get of Paul, is his previous life in Judaism. Then in chapter 9, we get kind of a second little cameo or picture of him. And that's in chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. And this is the story that tells of Paul's conversion. He's on the road, headed towards Damascus, chasing after Christians. And he is struck by a great light. He has a vision from Jesus that he needs to repent and to go and meet a Christian in Damascus who will help guide him and show him. And he follows through there in chapter 9. And this is the story of Paul's, sometimes we call it his Damascus Road experience, but it is his conversion to Christianity. And then in a third cameo, just very brief in chapter 11, in verses 25 and 26, we find the Apostle Paul being mentored by Barnabas, an early Christian who's known for being very hospitable and also generous and also very encouraging to other people. He brings Paul and introduces him to his fellow believers in the city of Antioch of Syria. And Paul is amongst this group of people. And this is here you'll find in this passage in Acts 11, 25 and 26. These are the first people that are called Christians by outsiders. Paul is amongst that early group. And then at the very end of Acts 12, we see a fourth appearance of the Apostle Paul. And this goes from chapter 12, verse 24, on into the first 3 verses of chapter 13. And what we see is the Apostle Paul is chosen along with Barnabas and John Mark, author of the Gospel of Mark, and a young believer very early on in the ministry of Jesus. We see the 3 of them, along with others, being chosen to be the first missionaries to go out and preach the gospel to Gentiles, to go to Asia Minor and begin to share the gospel. Now, so that's kind of those 3 people, Philip, Peter, and Saul, aka Paul, are the 3 people that we really want to focus on as we see the spread of the gospel throughout Samaria. I want to make some observations here. One is I want us to see that Peter and other apostles as well, early apostles, original 12 disciples, are still preaching and teaching and fulfilling the call that Jesus placed on their life. I think we should also note in this section that the seven who were dedicated for a service ministry in the church are also active, not only in serving and ministering, but in sharing the gospel. We see that at the very beginning with Stephen, and then also with Philip. And then we're beginning to see the spread of the gospel without Jewish baggage. And I think that's very important to see that. That's the big push that we see in Judea and Samaria, and that sets up the first three missionary journeys that are recorded in Acts chapters 13 through chapter 21, I believe, is the end of the third missionary journey. And that's what we're going to look at in part 3. Have a great day. Peace be with you.